Yogesh, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. I think firstly, before we get into it, one might want to find out what is the difference between maybe having an international portfolio and a domestic portfolio, and what is the attraction? Why would one go with that?
Well, I suppose with the higher rates of returns which are available in foreign countries, one would normally tend to want to invest offshore rather than concentrate on only domestic markets. So we are seeing a lot of offshore investments currently, and Africa being the flavor of the century, we are seeing a lot of investments, cross-border investments going into Africa these days.
Where in Africa exactly are we seeing these funds flowing through? You said Africa is the flavor of the century. Are there perhaps countries that are...
Yes, indeed. I mean, coming from Mauritius, and Mauritius being a platform for cross-border investments, we see a lot of investment and trade flows going into the SADC countries, the Southern African Development Community countries, so Eastern and Southern Africa. But having said this, we also have a lot of investments that go into Western African countries.
What are the biggest risks? Because one would think if you're looking at an international portfolio, there is some risk that
Yes.
comes with it in terms of diversifying. Some of those emerging markets can be seen as somewhat risky, and
Correct.
some of the other frontier markets. So if you're looking at it on an East-West and Southern Africa basis, I mean, what's the best place to start? And maybe also talk about some of those risks involved.
Yes, there are many risks associated with offshore investments. And in order to mitigate those risks, you need to find the best place to structure your investment. And Mauritius, I think, is one of the best places for structuring African investments. Why? Because, first of all, Mauritius is a treaty-based jurisdiction. So it helps it helps international investors to mitigate their tax positions. Secondly, on top of the double taxation agreements, and now we're talking about some 40 double taxation agreements that Mauritius has signed with other countries, some 20 of which are with African countries only. We also have the investment promotion and protection agreements, which protects the return of the capital and the return from the investee country. So basically, you know, it protects against risk of expropriation of assets, for example.
So basically, we are looking at some of these reforms that have been put into place in
Yes.
order to make the movement of funds and to make investors feel
Yes.
a lot safer about where they are.
Yes.
At the moment, you know, where else are we seeing countries picking up on reforms? If I think about reforms, one country that comes to mind is the likes of Rwanda, who's done pretty well. You've mentioned Mauritius.
Yes.
Where else are we seeing the adaptation of these reforms?
Yes, I mean, we have countries like Rwanda who is doing very well, and indeed trying to be a sort of financial center for Africa. Yeah.
One of the other things in terms of your international portfolio that came to mind is what we call estate and wealth transfer planning.
Yes.
What exactly is that?
Well, to put it in a simple way, it's basically about high net worth individuals, so rich people providing for succession planning. You know, so it's planning for future generations.
Yeah. Exactly, but so they're talking about estate specifically. Are we making sure that when it comes to looking for the right real estate, that it is in a place where your generations to come would not depreciate, or
Yes, it doesn't only cover real estate. It basically covers all the assets of a high net worth individual. You know, you would like to, if you are a rich person, if you are a high net worth individual, you would want to ensure that there's proper succession planning, there's asset protection, and you know that the wealth that you have is properly passed down to future generations.
Let's also talk about maybe something that may be also applicable in terms of businesses, and that would be in terms of structuring cross-border investments. How are we doing on the continent in terms of that? We are trying to move towards regional integration, having deeper, capital markets. How are we doing in terms of cross-border investments?
Yeah, cross-border investments is very much encouraged now, and we have organizations like the SADC or the COMESA, which not only encourages cross-border investments, but also cross-border trades. amongst countries. So it allows for preferential tariff rates to be applied in those regions.
There's always been talk that, whenever you talk about cross-border, it becomes very cumbersome. There's a lot of administration and paperwork. Are you seeing perhaps banks coming forward and offering platforms where it's easier to invest and trade between cross-borders?
Oh yes, and banks like AfrAsia Bank in Mauritius, we facilitate a lot of those trade flows and those cross-border investments. By providing the cash management, the treasury, the opening of accounts in different currencies, and so we do facilitate those types of investments.
So you've definitely been seeing a pickup in these types of transactions.
Yes, indeed.
Going forward, what else can we expect from AfrAsia in terms of of being able to facilitate investment within the different African countries and in Mauritius?
Well, currently we're working with a lot of international investors, what we call limited partners, and who work with local GPs, general partners in Africa. And very often, we see there's a mismatch in the raising of capital from those limited partners, and there's a cash flow problem. And we try to assist those international structures that are set up in Mauritius in order to raise their funds and to basically facilitate the investments until the capital calls are received from the international investors. So basically it's like a bridge financing